I've taught on this many times, and it's probably not really necessary for to address it to my subs because I'm preaching to the choir. But whenever I saw pastors give cries of unity, they would start doing a round of teachings on unity, and it was always a tool to stifle dissent, and it was usually a precursor to some agenda they were about to push that they knew was going to meet resistance. And later I found out that they were actually following a preconceived, written out plan by the Leadership Network by Rick Warren about tools for transformation, how to produce transformation in your church through small groups and teachings on unity, to stigmatize and stifle dissent and soften up the ground so people are willing to embrace changes faster. And what that was all about was, how can we convert our churches to match the seeker-sensitive model that was originally advocated by people like Robert Schuller and Rick Warren and this guy Peter Drucker, who was a business guy who was implementing corporate principles of total quality management. He was teaching that to Schuller and Warren, who were his disciples, as ways to control and organize large groups of Christians to rapidly bring them through transformation that would otherwise take decades. And this Leadership Network is a pastor's network of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pastors in every kind of denomination that are all jumping on board with this purpose-driven, seeker-friendly church movement thing that happened in the last 20 years that eventually gave birth to the emergent church, which is seeker-friendly for postmodernism, for people who don't even believe that there's objective truth. But they were targeting the consumers and saying, how do we make our church, how do we change our church so that it will attract people who are not comfortable in church settings? Now, the reason they're not comfortable in church settings is because they don't believe the gospel. But it was thought that if you could make it more like a coffee shop, make it more like the world, and appeal to the demographic around you in the neighborhood in which you live, change the songs and water down the messages, you could have a better success at reaching the lost. Reaching the lost, though, didn't necessarily mean getting them to understand the gospel anymore. It really meant getting them to grow your church, and it was a business plan. And Saddleback Church was one of the first ones that implemented this in a larger scale. And anyway, the point is, all these pastors learned this as part of their playbook of, hey, if you're going to implement change, it's going to encounter resistance from the old guard of, Orthodox, conservative, Bible-believing people. They're going to resist. So you need to teach on unity, and then you need to organize into small groups, and you need to appoint facilitators who are supportive of your agenda, and you need to have conversations in the small groups that slowly present points to loosen up people so that they learn to fellowship with people who disagree. And the troublemakers will be spotted early on and weeded out, because in those small groups, they're going to have a problem with some of the things you're presenting, and they're going to show it on their face or say something. And then what you need to do is show them that they can have their so-called opinion, but they need to accommodate the view of others for the sake of unity. And you'll shame them into silence, or they'll get stigmatized to the point where they'll leave. And so this was a deliberate tactic to weed out Bible-believing conservatives or Bible-believing Orthodox Christians from these purpose-driven, seeker-friendly model churches. It actually was a deliberate part of the plan because they were going to be the stumbling block for this transformation of Christianity. And when I read this stuff, and I'll have to get I'll get the books and some quotes together to show that this move for unity in Christianity is from Rome, and it's following a well mapped out pattern and has been since Vatican II and before, but it's a counter-reformation. The plan is to bring the churches back under Rome. And so that's happening at the institutional level. And what it is it's the pastor is allowed to say whatever he wants, while the church members are expected to keep the unity and tolerance and not bring up, not quibble over words and not address so-called secondary issues. So they would say, the primary issues of what we believe is X, Y, Z. Anything else is secondary, not worth breaking fellowship. Oh, okay. And you learn that in the small group, and then you go sit in the auditorium and listen to the pastor go on and on and on exclusively about secondary issues. And you're sitting there learning to walk in love and keep unity with him, even though unity and fellowship is based only on primary issues. So it's not a unity of fellowship, it is a unity of silence. It's an imposed unity. And it looks like it's grassroots because it came out of the teaching in the small groups, but actually the pastor's behind it, and he's got an agenda, and he wants everybody to think they agree so that when he finally announces his agenda, there's very little resistance, and they can change churches really fast this way. And that's why Protestant Christianity has been rapidly transforming in the last 2 decades to the point where it's almost unrecognizable. And fundamentalist or whatever, Orthodox, Bible-believing Christians can't find a home there anymore. And that's by design too. They're not supposed to be there anymore. This movement is going back to Rome. There's no place for an actual Protestant in it. Okay? So, here's the thing. The cry for unity from people who don't want to fellowship with me is absolutely irrelevant and theoretical. The Pope can cry for unity, but he's in Rome and I'm here where I live. So it's theoretical. I'm never going to meet the Pope. If he were actually a believer, I could acknowledge that he's my brother, but he's over there and I'm over here. There can be no manifestation of unity. Unity is local in the Bible. That's why the churches, they didn't keep a unity among, across the board. Their unity was local, and they were addressed to deal with, they had autonomy, and they were addressed as a local church in that city. And any problems they had of division was a problem in their fellowship. It's irrelevant to say, oh, I'm, one with Rick Warren, even if he is a believer. That means absolutely nothing. What means something is when brothers and sisters actually can dwell together in unity, based on fellowship, on the essentials. And where the essentials are not allowed, there is no practical expression of unity. There is unification, which is political and false. And it's a part of the world system. It's part of the spirit of the age. It's not the Holy Spirit. And that's a tactic. Usually the people who are crying loudest for unity are doing it to stifle dissent. Because they're not talking about the unity in the Bible. Because they don't want fellowship with you. There's a guy crying out for unity in this town. And he doesn't want fellowship with me. I live in the same town as him. I've reached out to him several times. Hey, we should have coffee, something. No answer. But what he wants is the freedom to say whatever he wants to say. And he doesn't want to be challenged. And that's why they call for unity. It is totally disingenuous. It's not that they want fellowship. And then they use shame, what did the world think? This is why they're not becoming Christians, because we've all been arguing. Well, okay, we all got saved because of the gospel, knowing that Christendom was splintered into 1,000 sects. Unity didn't save me. I didn't see an expression of unity that goes, oh, that's why I want to be a Christian. No, actually, I learned that the gospel said the exact opposite of what Christians said it was. The Bible said something that the Christians never told me it meant. And I realized that Christianity was wrong and the Bible was true. And finally I got saved. Yes, it is true that Christianity is a stumbling block to people getting saved, but it's not because we're not united. It's because we don't contend for the truth. It's because we're so watered down that most people can't even articulate what it is they believe and why. Because you're not allowed to teach in depth. Because you step on too many toes. You know? Now the hyper-dispensationalist thing, I've contended for the truth regarding hyper-dispensationalism quite a few times. But I'll have fellowship with a believer if he really wants fellowship. I have fellowship on my wall with cessationalists. I have fellowship on my wall with charismatics. I have fellowship with a few people who do believe that there is no rapture. Less and less. But it's not because I'm making an issue of it. But with the hyper-dispensationalist thing, I have yet to meet a hyper-dispensationalist that doesn't make it an issue and doesn't close down the fellowship. But that's just the way it is, and it's been like that. H.A. Ironside addressed that 150 years ago or 100 years ago. So, this is one of the most divisive movements we've seen because every person who gets converted to hyper-dispensationalism becomes furious and separates from believers over it. That's not us. That's a fruit of that doctrine. And to say, oh, take down your sword, no, because it has implications for how you see justification by faith. If you believe justification was by works in other dispensations, then you don't understand what Paul said about justification by faith and how it works. Abraham was justified in uncircumcision without works. And it's always been like that and always will. And for the sake of teaching justification by faith thoroughly enough for somebody to stand on it so that they're confident, you do have to address these different systems. Am I generalizing and saying hyper-dispensationalists all are work backloaders? No, most of them are not. They don't know that this is the pitfall. But I have yet to be able to talk to one long enough to even get to that point because they're so mad. That's not my, that's on them. If they want to tone their argument down for the sake of fellowship, then we can have fellowship. But honestly, that's being used, as another diversion to keep people from really pursuing the truth and hearing the truth, stifling dissent so people can say whatever they want to say. And they're just using that as an example. People keep talking about hyper-dispensationalism. Why can't we just all get along? How can I have fellowship if you don't put down your sword? You mean the sword of the Spirit? You want me to put that down? When Paul talks about unity, he says, it's right for me to have you in my heart, since in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all fellow partakers with me of grace. And he says, I just want you to stand worthy of the gospel, walk worthy of the gospel, so that whether I'm with you or absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you're standing and striving in one spirit with one accord for the faith of the gospel. And you're bold and you're contending for it, not being afraid of your adversaries, which is to them a token of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. No, unity is expressed in a fight. Unity is not what we think it is, where everybody is just at rest in the cemetery. No, unity is manifested where the gospel is being proclaimed and contended for. Because then all the distinctions are addressed and people come along and start walking in agreement. Because the system of air that surrounded them is broken off, and their spirit has a chance to be released, and as they walk in their freedom as sons of God. So occasionally I have to address this from time to time. These false appeals to unity always make me sick because I know what they're used for. It's never have I seen it in a genuine way to reach out and actually have fellowship. It's always to stifle dissent, or silence one party or another. All right, take care.